U.S. President Joe Biden is on his way back to Washington from Poland, where he reassured NATO countries an attack against one is an attack against all.
Article 5 is a sacred commitment the United States has made. We will defend literally every inch of NATO.
Biden's remarks come one day after Russia pulled out of the last remaining nuclear arms control pact with the United States, invoking fear of nuclear confrontation.
Президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Putin.
Russian President Vladimir Putin, meanwhile, appeared at a rally in Moscow where he hailed his troops fighting in Ukraine. The crowd chanted, "Russia, Russia, Russia." This Friday marks the one-year anniversary of Putin's full-scale invasion. David Cohen is U.S. Ambassador to Canada. He joins us now from Edmonton. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me on.
So we're approaching the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion. Neither side is backing down. Ukraine says it can win, but it needs the weapons, notably fighter jets, to do so. So why aren't the Allies just giving Kyiv all of the equipment it needs to defeat Russia on the battlefield?
Well, I'm extremely proud of the leadership that President Joe Biden has demonstrated throughout this entire conflict. Speaking for the United States, we've now provided more than $27 billion of military assistance to Ukraine, and providing a variety of elements of support in different levels of sophistication. I'm the U.S. ambassador to Canada. I'm not a military or arms expert. I have to leave that to our professionals, and I'm perfectly content to stand on the track record of the United States in supplying such a wide variety of weapons and military assistance at all different levels of sophistication. I think we have demonstrated through our actions, in addition to the president's words, that we will stand behind Ukraine, we will support Ukraine, we will give Ukraine what it needs to be able to win this war, and will be there for Ukraine for the duration.
There's been this pattern, though, throughout the past year of a hesitancy to give a certain level of military aid or weapons that is then later moved past. And we saw that with the Patriot system, for example, in the early days of the war. That was not going to happen. Now it has happened. I wonder, with fighter jets, is it fear of provoking Russia that's holding the West back from going all in on support for Ukraine?
So again, I'm not an expert on arms and military strategy. I'm very comfortable with the experts we have in Washington on this subject, making judgments on a daily basis about the sophistication of the military equipment that Ukraine needs to wage a successful war. What you label as reluctance that is subsequently reversed may just be changes in circumstances at different times of this war. And again, I think our actions speak louder than any words. I mean, we have, in providing $27 billion of military support to Ukraine, we have far outpaced the military assistance provided by every other country in the world combined for Ukraine. I don't think there can be any doubt about the importance that the United States places on making sure that Ukraine has the weapons that it needs and the military assistance that it needs to prevail in this unjustified and illegal war.
No, I'm certainly not trying to suggest the U.S. hasn't stepped up and delivered military aid. I think that is manifestly obvious. But we do have these warnings from the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken that maybe now China is actively considering providing Russia with weapons and ammunition. China is rejecting that claim as false. I wonder, sir, what is your sense of China's intentions here?
I think I'm going to stand with my Secretary of State. This is something we should all be concerned about and conscious of. And the United States has made quite clear to China through diplomatic channels and publicly that it does not believe it would be appropriate or constructive for China to supply military assistance to Russia, given the illegal and brutal nature of this war. And so I think we'll continue to position ourselves by making clear that China is aware of the unhappiness of the United States and the United States' allies should China decide to poke its nose into this conflict.
Just days after that warning from Secretary Blinken, President Xi's senior foreign policy advisor was in Moscow, and he said that China is ready to deepen its strategic partnership with Russia, with Iran providing Russia with weapons, China potentially doing the same. Is a new axis of some sort emerging here now?
So David, I don't know if it's a new axis. I think you've got a classic conflict that's set up, and again, President Biden talks about this extremely articulately, and that the conflict that's set up is a conflict between democracies of the world and autocracies, and the president has been quite clear that in the end he believes that democracy will prevail over autocracy, and he's doing everything possible from a foreign policy perspective, from a military arms perspective, to ensure that democracy has the full opportunity to take on autocracy and ultimately to prevail.
Given that polarization that you've outlined there, this sort of binary world that is maybe emerging, certainly at a great power level, and the declining global security environment as a result of that, I mean, with all of the money you've given and all of the aid you've given to Ukraine, do countries like Canada need to lay out a clearer commitment to hit things like the NATO target of 2% on defense spending?
So I'm of one mind here, which is that it's not fair to understate or underestimate the impact and the leadership that Canada has provided in connection with Russia's illegal war on Ukraine. Canada has stepped up to provide military assistance. They have stepped up to provide humanitarian assistance. They have stepped up as a home for refugees from Ukraine, and they have stepped up in a very significant way in helping to lead the imposition of sanctions against Russia, and in a way that, quite frankly, they can be more effective with other democracies around the world than the United States might be able to be. So I prefer to look at this entire horrible year as through the glass half full kind of lens, to mix a lot of analogies, of saying how marvelous it's been, how the world's democracies have pulled together, and how Canada has helped to lead the collection of world democracies to provide an unprecedented level of military assistance, of humanitarian assistance, and a hospitable environment for refugees that feel the need to get out of Ukraine. And most importantly, the most robust, providing leadership on the most robust series of sanctions that have ever been imposed on any country in the world. And make no mistake, those sanctions are working. Russia's GDP is being hit hard by the sanctions, and Russia is feeling pain as a result of its continuing to wage this illegal war.
I'm certainly not trying to talk down Canada's role in this or Canada's leadership on those other fronts, but when the call comes for military aid, Canada was only able to send 4 tanks because of the state of the armored divisions of the Canadian military. The request for planes, I'm not sure Canada could answer it at all. And we've seen other countries lay out a path to 2%, with Germany being the most notable to do that. And other countries do lead battle groups in NATO as well as Canada does. So I just wonder, is it acceptable for Canada to not be able to provide the military hardware on the same scale as other nations because it has lagged below that 2% for so long?
So I think there are a couple of questions embedded in that question. And I'm the U.S. ambassador to Canada. I'm not Canadian government official, and I don't think it's appropriate for me or for the United States to tell Canada you should be spending X on defense. In terms of the NATO commitment, I have observed that the Wales commitment was a commitment made by the government of Canada. It was not made by the United States. The government of Canada committed to move its defense spending to 2%, to the level of 2% of GDP. And I do remain hopeful that Canada will continue to make investments in its defense budget in order to reach that level. Last year, Canada did add $8 billion to its defense budget, which was a significant increase. As they say, $8 billion is real money. But it did not move Canada to the 2% of GDP level. And I remain hopeful that Canada will continue to invest in defense to be able to do that. But Canada's making investments in defense. It made a commitment to NORAD modernization with billions of dollars of additional spending. They made a commitment to purchase 88 F-35s to modernize its air fleet, and most importantly, to modernize its fleet in a way that is compatible with the U.S. fleet and with the NATO fleet and with the fleet of many allies. So we can have conversations about timing and pace, but I think it's clear that Canada is making a commitment to increase its spending. And we'll look forward to this year's budget and see what additional progress Canada is making toward its own self-stated goal of bringing its defense spending to 2% of GDP.
Ambassador Cohen, I appreciate your candor and your time. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
It's a pleasure to be on. Thank you very much.
Poland hosted U.S. President Joe Biden today for talks on Ukraine as Russia approaches the one-year mark of its invasion.
We are meeting almost exactly on the anniversary of the event which has forever changed the history of our part of Europe and which has an impact on the security situation across the world.
Poland is currently in talks with the U.S. to build up its American military presence there, even when Poland has built up one of Europe's strongest armies. Radek Sikorski is a member of the European Parliament and the former Foreign Minister of Poland. Mr. Sikorski, thanks for joining me.
Hello.
I'd like to start, if I could, sir, with the latest from President Duda, who says he told President Joe Biden that he'd like to see more U.S. soldiers and equipment moved permanently to bases in Poland. You've long advocated for an increased NATO presence in your country. Do you think Washington is nearing the point of this permanent American presence in your country?
I hope so. We were advocating first for contingency plans, then for permanent presence. But I think it's clear to everyone is where the threat is, and the presence should be where the threat is.
Ukraine says the threat is in its skies right now, and it's asking the West for planes. President Duda says if the Allies agreed to do that, Poland would donate MiGs first. Do you think the West should send jets, and can Ukraine win without jets?
Yes, we should, and Polish MiGs would be excellent because Ukrainian pilots wouldn't need any training to use them. They could use them right away.
There's been a hesitancy, though, sir, throughout the war to give Ukraine the heavy weapons it asked for. We've seen reluctance on air defense systems, on tanks, and then eventually they relent. Do you think we're going to see a similar pattern happening with jets?
There should be no restrictions. Almost 150 nations voted in the UN to condemn Russian aggression. Ukraine has been invaded without provocation. It has every right to defend itself by all means available, and we are in our right to help Ukraine to do so.
Why do you think there is such a hesitancy to send fighter jets to Ukraine? I know there's been a persistent concern throughout this of widening the conflict and dragging NATO into war, and jets obviously could fly out of Ukrainian airspace into Russian airspace to launch strikes inside Russian territory. Is that it, or is there something else at play here?
The tanks or jets don't widen the conflict. We are not going to get into a direct war with Russia, and Ukraine has no intention of bombing Russia. It just wants to chase Russian invaders from its own territory.
You told the BBC yesterday, sir, I believe it was, that we, meaning the Allies, mustn't play for a draw. We must play for Ukrainian victory, and war will stop when Russia decides it's no longer worth it. What needs to happen to get to that point from where things stand right now?
Well, if you look by historic precedent, the French in Indochina or in Algeria, the British in Ireland, the Portuguese in Angola, the Spaniards in Latin America, there comes a point when the colonial power decides that it's not worth it. And it depends on where your pain threshold is and how steep or flat your learning curve is. I assumed that if the Russians lose 100,000 people, they would have second thoughts, but obviously their learning curve is not as steep as I thought.
Where are they on their pain threshold right now in your analysis, sir?
Well, think about it. 100,000 people in a year means 1 million in 10 years. Staggering numbers. But Ukraine has to defend itself, and I hope the Chinese will tell President Putin that now that America has planted its standard in Kiev and that we are ramping up our support for Ukraine, that Russia has bitten more than it can chew.
Are you concerned about China possibly entering the conflict at this stage? I know Secretary of State Blinken issued a pretty stark warning to Beijing on Sunday, I believe it was. But Beijing's top diplomat was in Moscow this week. And they certainly have the industry and the economic might to influence what's happening on the battlefield. How concerned are you right now that China might decide to help Russia?
I was there in Munich when Secretary Blinken said it, and I think it's an instance of the US again strategically using its intelligence to preempt mistakes. And China has a choice. It can be a peacemaker, but then it would have to use its influence on Putin and aggregate the interests of both parties. Or it can enter the war on the side of Russia with, for example, lethal supplies for Russia. And then I would be really concerned because I think millions of consumers around the world would take a very dim view about this. And I certainly don't want to see a trade war between us, the West, and China.
So given the anxiety over the potential of Chinese involvement and your analysis earlier about the pain threshold and the learning curve, there is an impetus to get this over with quickly if possible. So is the West giving Ukraine what it needs to win or giving it just enough so that it doesn't lose and sort of fights to a stalemate? Where are we on that?
From what I hear, Russia has it in her to carry out one more offensive with the half of the Russian army that has not yet been destroyed. But that offensive is not likely to succeed. It will not deliver the kind of decapitating punch that Ukraine would find difficult to resist. They don't have reserves, they don't have the second strategic echelon. So they may make some gains, but Ukraine will continue. And then in a month or two, Ukraine will go on counter-offensive. And it's the fate of that counter-offensive that will decide whether that will be the point at which Russia says, okay, we can't win this, or whether this conflict becomes chronic, like previous colonial wars that usually take between half a decade and a decade.
A final question, sir, about Poland. Its role and leadership have been central in supporting Ukraine from the very early days of this, with some people talking about the strategic power in Europe shifting to the east. I mean, how has this conflict changed things in your country?
Yes, Poland is crucial, first of all, as a logistical hub, but also in the last couple of days, we are a political hub. So yes, we've been vindicated, unfortunately, in our warnings against Putin, and finally our Western friends have appreciated that they need to listen to us now. But we need to also pay, while we fight for democracy in Ukraine, we also need to pay attention to rule of law in our own country.
Okay, Radek Sikorski, it was nice to meet you. Thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Goodbye.